So this is a preservation shelter, which was the first step that was finished in 2009 with an investment of approximately $1.2 million, all by the Serbian government to allow the restoration of the mosaic pavements that were discovered here. When this site was first located as a Roman archaeological site in the 1950s, construction of an apartment building, which was destined to be here, was stopped, and the archaeologists came to excavate. And then for the next 40 years, this site was preserved in the open, and it is not a good way to preserve an archaeological site because it's a human factor that if you have a hole in the ground in a city, people throw garbage in it. And so every spring we had to have a major cleaning operation, so that with the solution that was found in 2007, 2008, and finally finished in 2009, we now have the basis for conservation. In 2011, there were funds from the United States State Department that were given to begin the conservation of the more than a dozen Roman mosaic pavements that were found here. And along with the input and funding of the Serbian government, we started the preservation and presentation of the original floor decorations in the palace. So now what you see behind me are two rooms. The first one has a marble fountain in it that was restored, and then a mosaic, and then the mosaic on the wall, which has an image of the Roman god Mercury, was underneath the mosaic that is in the room itself today. So that the secondary solution here is to take what I would call the extra mosaics that can't be presented in place, to present them on the walls of this shelter. That's why everything is bare now, but eventually we'll have mosaic pavements every place, we hope. It's a slow process. Now we've finished not we, but the Zavod for Zaštitu Spomeniku Kultura, which would be the Institute for the Protection of Cultural Monuments. This mosaic right here, the long one, is the second one that's been finished. And then funds have been acquired for up beneath the Mercury Mosaic that's on the wall to start preserving that mosaic. What we are looking at is just maybe a very small part of the original Roman palace. So we have to take us in time back to the 4th century after the birth of Christ. Actually 10 years before that, in around 290 AD, the Emperor Diocletian was here. He had to be here to command the Roman armies on the Danube, which is just across the mountains here. And so he started building this palace. And when we talk about a Roman imperial palace, we mean a place where the Roman emperor actually ruled the empire from. And along with the palace, he built a circus, which the Greeks called a hippodrome, but the Romans used the word circus for chariot racing. And that's an important aspect of imperial palaces in the reorganization of the Roman Empire that Diocletian instituted, because the emperor presented himself to his subjects in the building that had the largest type of seating capacity. So a circus will hold 60 to 100,000 spectators, and the Roman emperor could present himself to his subjects there. That's the ancient version of a media photo opportunity, should we call it. We can guarantee, for example, that the Roman Emperor Constantine, who was born in the southern Serbian city of Niš, was here for over 500 days, because when the Romans issued a law, they dated it month, day, and year, plus place of issue. And so we can say that 504 days the Emperor Constantine was guaranteed here, but probably much more than that, between 317 and 324. This is an important location. If you look at, let's say, the modern autoput between Zagreb and Belgrade, along that same route, there was a Roman road that followed approximately the same direction. And when Constantine defeated his western rival Maxentius in 312 AD outside of Rome, Constantine began moving slowly down from the west, pushing the Eastern Emperor Licinius, who was residing here, pushing him farther and farther east so that he gained control of more and more of the empire. Finally, in 317, In Osijek, there was a major battle fought, and Licinius had to flee all the way over to what is today Turkey. And Constantine took up his residence in this building right here. So this is one of the maybe 10 or 12 places in the whole Roman Empire where the emperor resided with his family, where he had a private residence. And what we are looking at here are probably the private parts of the palace. They're small rooms. They're not big receiving rooms or throne rooms or law court buildings or anything like that. The estimate, the rough estimate here is that maybe this is 1/10 of the original area of the palace. To give you an idea of scale, the circus, which is right in the street, under the street next to the palace here, was over 500 meters long. And so that was a huge structure, and probably this was a very huge structure too. Now, courtesy of a European Union grant, we have a three-dimensional reconstruction that we show on the monitor over here that gives you an impression of what the palace would have looked like outside and inside. And the other parts that we see down here are harder to interpret because in total the palace has about 120-year history, and so there are different phases of construction. And a problem that we have here is that we're showing all of the phases at once. And so when a person looks here, you're looking at foundations of buildings, and you don't really see what the whole rooms look like. But when we use the three-dimensional reconstruction that we have down here, then we can get an idea of what the walls would be like when we reconstruct. This is then the type of what historic preservationists today call in situ preservation. We have the original building, the original remains, and for us in the Imperial Palace, the most important artifacts that were found are the remains of the interior decorations, the mosaic pavements. And through the mosaic pavements, at least we can get some idea of the taste of the Roman emperors, perhaps the Roman emperors' wives, in interior decoration. So that's a direct contact with the personalities who lived here. And that's very important. But what we have now with the help of DCC and the German Agency for International Cooperation and the United States State Department, and behind everything, the Republic of Serbia, we have a multimedia presentation, we have panels, we have video, and we have the actual ongoing site preservation and presentation itself. So it's taken, it's taken 10 years now to get to where we are today. So, but we're still going. When I was a graduate student at Stanford, that's where I did my doctorate, I heard from one of my professors that, we can go right over that a colleague was looking for students in Roman archaeology to go on a project in Yugoslavia, 1967. And so I went. We had a project in Bileća in Herzegovina. And they put me out in the middle of a field. We were excavating what they call gomile there with 12 Bosnian teenagers. And I didn't speak Serbian, they didn't speak English, but somehow we managed to discover a 12-room Roman villa with mosaics. The mosaic still today is on the landing leading to the second floor of the Zemaljski Muzej in Sarajevo. And from then on, I kept working for the next 30 years on archaeological projects here. First in Split and Sirmium, and then we finally moved to have our own projects interior in what was still Yugoslavia around Kosmaj, and then in eastern Serbia. So this is my 51st year here, if you can believe that. This is a very interesting, and when we go back up, we can take a picture of the panel there. This might have been the center of the palace. You can see the four corners with these very heavy foundations which would support piers. And we have analogous evidence from other Roman imperial sites that this would often be like an imperial shrine. And in the middle of this would be probably a porphyry statue of either a deceased emperor or a living emperor. And so this was sort of a shrine of, you might call it a shrine of the imperial cult. And There's very little of it left, but it's got to be something like that with these are very important, these four bases, which should be a very strong piers. And when we take a picture of the panel up there, you'll see a reconstruction. So maybe this was the center of the palace, an open courtyard with a shrine in the middle of it with a porphyry statue. I'm mentioning porphyry, which is the red imperial stone, because when we go to the museum, we'll see a reconstructed porphyry statue from fragments that were found across the street here. So.
And can you tell us, how do you feel about that period, about Romans here? How do you see that?
Well, a lot of things were happening here. The events that happen here are events that changed the whole history of Europe, because this is the first area on the Danube frontier, which is just over by Novi Sad, that the barbarians started to penetrate the Roman defenses and come into the empire, and that changes the whole ethnic composition of this area. Before that, we have what you might call, and I frown on saying this, but a Celtic Illyrian population. Illyrian's a very difficult term to define, but anyhow, those are sort of the indigenous peoples that the Romans found here. But then when we move through, the palace is destroyed at the end of the 4th century and into the next century. We're going to see a church later on that was destroyed in around 430 AD, so half a century after the palace was in use. And then in the 6th century, at the end of that, around 570, the Avars come in and destroy all of Sirmium, and along with the Avars came the Slavs. And the Avars moved along and sort of disappeared from history. But as you know, the Slavs stayed. They brought their families with them, and they started farming. And so Mitrovica as a city is reborn again with a new ethnic basis. But there were still people who called themselves Romai, Romans, even though they weren't Italian Romans at all, but they were remnants of the Roman Empire. And the Byzantine Empire controlled from Constantinople this area on and off for a while, but nonetheless we start the whole history of the Slavic Middle Ages here too. So these walls were all covered in fresco, painting on plaster. And so right down here is a little bit of an original plaster wall decoration. Fresco is a very fragile type of artifact. I'll get out of the way too. Let me get out of there. Because as soon as moisture gets behind it, it starts to fall off of the wall. And so usually it's preserved in corners and at the bases of walls. And it's a losing battle to try to protect it and restore it, although we're going to do some of it over here. This is probably a good place to look at what we call the Mercury Mosaic. Usually with just this much preserved of a mosaic, you wouldn't spend a lot of money preserving it and presenting it, but it's the only mosaic that's found in the palace that has a figural representation on it. And the second thing, if you look at the left-hand side of the head, you can see a little wing sticking out of the head. That's what Western Union uses as a logo today for Mercury, but it's a pagan divinity. And it's probably not a coincidence, although I can't guarantee this is the truth, but that this mosaic was created when Diocletian, a pagan, non-Christian emperor, resided in the palace. Diocletian was adamantly anti-Christian. And so we have a pagan divinity that was in this room over here. After that, there are no figural mosaics. They're all geometric patterns without representations of pagan religion whatsoever. So that might be significant. Those are the type of circumstantial arguments you have to make in late antiquity in a time so far away from our own time where we don't have a lot of documentation, so that we have to make leaps of faith in ancient history sometimes. We can go up more and look at up here too. Now where you see sand here, like in this space, there are mosaic pavements underneath. This is our next place where we're going to do conservation. There's a little bit of it there. In 1974, this mosaic was conserved. It was actually taken apart and then reset in a concrete base. And starting in 2012, with the help of the American State Department and the Republic of Serbia, we cut this mosaic into 37 pieces, and along with the grant that we had, we actually opened a Mosaic Restoration laboratory in our Institute for the Preservation of Monuments building with air conditioning, with heat, with water, and so all of these segments were taken back. The backsides were cleaned, the 1970s cement, which was in mode for conservation then, which is horrible, it's too hard and can't be reversed. These were all taken over, cleaned, and then the top was clean. And then where you see the white part, excuse me, the white parts, that is all reconstruction. And for 4 summers, we had American university students working with conservators from the Belgrade Institute for the Conservation of Monuments doing an internship in mosaic restoration. The city of Sremska Mitrovica paid for their housing, they paid for their transportation, and so that they got to work on actual mosaics. So there's an international cooperation that resulted in this restoration of the pavement. We are going to put some sort of coating on this to make it darker so it doesn't have such a strong contrast. But one of the obligations you have in historic preservation is to alert the public to the fact that some parts of this are not original. So we have to be authentic. And authenticity is an important thing in historic and heritage tourism too, because people are excited when they see what we would call the real thing. And so that we have to take care to do that, but you have a moral obligation not to deceive the public too. And that's, again, comes back to the idea of quality of information. And the fountain this was the first thing actually that was restored here. The Republic of Serbia gave the first grant for this. This was the equivalent of about $19,000. What was found originally was just the base of the fountain. And then what were found along with it on the floor were those little square parts of the vertical mosaic, which we call tesserae, but they had gold leaf in them, which is pretty rare. We've added to the walls, we built them up a little bit. We've put fresco back on the base of the walls we don't have the originals, but we have good Roman analogies that this is authentic types of decoration. And then the red, probably the most famous Roman wall painting color is what is called Pompeian red from the city of Pompeii. And so, but in the 4th century, these panels without much in the way of figural pictures were standard in Roman buildings. So it's pretty authentic for that period. So eventually, as we move along in the process of conservation here, we want to come back to an appreciation of how the palace was decorated. We have what we have to still explain a little bit better, an under the floor heating system here, which we explain in one of these panels, probably that one up there. And so we have the heating system, we have the interior decoration, and we have the foundation walls. And that's what we have for an imperial palace. But if we wanted to see, probably the best preserved imperial palace in the Balkans is in Thessaloniki, Galerius's palace, who was the son-in-law of Diocletian, who founded this palace. The cultural route is based on 4 categories of association with Roman emperors. And the first and most important category is places where the Roman emperors actually were. So this we can document here. And then we have other related categories that talk about Roman policy of frontier defense, the Roman military, and things of that nature. So that let's take 2 more sites that are on the Roman emperor's route. Diocletians Palace in Split. I was lucky enough to work on excavations there from 1968 through 1971 and did my doctoral dissertation on that, on the architecture of the site. And that is the place that Diocletian chose to retire in. So if you wanted to say when Diocletian was active as an emperor, he was here a lot. When in 305 he decided to abdicate in the month of May, he went to Split. And the one sentence we have about what he was doing then, it says that he was raising cabbages in his villa near Salona. And that's all that they say about him. But supposedly Diocletian was born near Salona outside of the city of Split today. So we have a retirement villa. Technically, the word palace doesn't apply to Split very well because it was a place where the emperor was no longer emperor. He was a retired emperor. You could say the same about our probably best preserved Roman site in Serbia, Romuliana, Gamzigrad, kod Zajačara. And Galerius, the son-in-law of Diocletian, built his retirement villa supposedly close to where he was born, which would be Romuliana, and named it after his mother, who was named Romula. We have that attested in several of the sources. And it's a question whether or not Galerius actually ever was in Romuliana, because his palace was in Thessaloniki. And if you go to Thessaloniki today, there are remains of the palace there, and there's a huge circular building separate from the palace, which the Greeks call the Rotunda. There's a little bit of a problem with interpretation there, but it's clear from other examples of Roman palaces, like Diocletian's villa in Split with a mausoleum there, that was the Rotunda in Thessaloniki was intended to be Galerius's mausoleum. But later it was converted into a Christian church, and that's the way the interpretation sort of stays today. But as it happened in, I'm thinking about 309, Galerius had been here in Sirmium to appoint a new Caesar. Actually, yes, he had been here in 309 to appoint Licinius as the new Caesar for the East, and Licinius was residing here. Licinius is the one eventually that Constantine eliminated. And then Galerius made his way on the road that went down to the mouth of the Morava River and then inland to Niš, and then started out on the Roman road which led from Niš to Sofia, which was Roman Serdica. Before he got to Serdica, he died. He had some sort of horrible intestinal cancer or something, and instead of taking him all the way back to Thessaloniki, they brought him back to Romuliana and buried him on the Magura hill overlooking the villa at Romuliana. And there are two, discovered in the 1990s, two remains of mausolea there, one presumably for his mother who died first, and then his mausoleum, and then two big circular structures where they cremated the remains of the mother, and a separate one where they cremated the remains of Galerius. That's the way the emperors were treated for funerary purposes at that point in time. So maybe the only time Galerius was in Romuliana was after his death, when his body was brought there. It's very difficult to deal with local interpretations. They call it an imperial palace there, and it certainly is the best preserved Roman architecture in all of Serbia. Serbia, for essentially in terms of surface area, a small country, has some of the best Roman remains in all the Balkan area. Except for maybe Thessaloniki, it has the best Roman archaeological remains. Croatia has good things if you talk about Pula and Split. We included a third site on the Roman emperor's route in Croatia, which is down at the mouth of the Neretva River. The Roman name was Ramona Noronha, and the modern name is the village of Vid. And it was an exceptional archaeological discovery that was made in the 1990s of a Roman imperial cult where the remains of 32 Roman statues were found in their original location in a temple that was dedicated to the cult of the Roman emperors. The Croatian government produced the only in situ archaeological site museum in probably all the Balkans, really, because they built the museum right over the remains of the Roman temple, and the statues are preserved in their original location and presented, and all the artifacts from around there. So it's hard to get to logistically, but it's an exceptional site. So you have, in Croatia, you have Noronha, which starts in the early empire and goes through Trajan in the 2nd century AD. You have Split, Diocletian from 305 on to the end of the empire when it becomes a refugee center. You have Salona outside of Split, which was founded Julius Caesar in 58 BC, when he was given 3 provinces to conduct military campaigns in, the 2 Gauls, which he's famous for. The 3rd province was Illyria, Illyricum actually for the Romans then, and that was the Dalmatian coast. And so Salona starts with Julius Caesar. And then you go up to Pula. Well, we go to Zadar, first of all. Zadar Romaniader was just like it is today, where the boats came across from Italy, and probably when Trajan invaded Dacia in 102 AD. At least the core army came across with him to Iader, Zadar, and then across the mountains to the Sava drainage, and then down here to Sirmium, and then down to Viminacium outside of Kostolac, and then crossed the Danube at Ram to invade Dacia. And so those are the connections with the Roman emperors I'm illustrating for you too. I have to be impartial, so that I would say in Bulgaria, let's start with Bulgaria, which is, you know about Croatia already, so that you should see Diocletians Palace in Split. But I would recommend, if you're there with transportation, to drive down the coast and to go to Noronha, Uvid, on the mouth of the Neretva River. That's an exceptional museum which is as good as anything in Europe, I think, because of the quality of the archaeological find and the presentation of it. And Tony Glucina is our colleague there, so Vladan can set you up with a contact. In Bulgaria, Plovdiv is a very interesting city. That's ancient Philippopolis. It's got Greek and Roman remains, beautiful new museum. We have trouble integrating them into the cultural route a bit. We have to get our political connections straight down there, but we're working on that. Rusa is our most enthusiastic Bulgarian site connection, and our colleague there, the director of the museum, is very good. And they have a small Roman site, but a very good museum there. In Bulgaria, the museums are not archaeological museums; they're museums of national history or something like that. From Rusa, you can go across the Danube into Romania, and I haven't visited all the sites recently in Romania, but Alba Iulia in Transylvania is very impressive for what they've done. The countries that are members of the European Union, and this includes Bulgaria then and Romania, have adopted the funding strategy of when they do an infrastructure grant, which involves millions of euros, they put on at the end of it cultural resource improvements, which is a small fraction of the budget, but for us means big money. And so they've made very good use of European Union funding there. And for my money, Alba Iulia is one of the best presented sites. It's a Roman legionary base in the middle of a medieval fortress, in the middle of a modern town. So it's a marvelous site. If you would ever get that far, to go to Constanza on the Black Sea is a good experience too. But maybe the next time you're here, you'll be standing on a real mosaic that's all in place.
Maybe under us.
It is under us. There it is. There's part of it right there. When we dedicated the palace on December 15th, 2009, we had both ministers of the economy and the Ministry of Culture here, plus the president of Serbia, and the American Cultural Attaché. We opened up, in every mosaic, we opened up one of these squares and cleaned them so that people at least could see what was underneath.
And how old is this one?
I can't tell you exactly. It's got to be from around 350 or something like that AD. So they're all 4th century, except for the one on the wall, which is late 3rd century. In the 1960s and 1970s, whenever archaeologists found a mosaic pavement, it was in fashion then put sand over it. It's cheap, it's effective, but it really is not effective because water goes through it, vegetation grows through it, and as soon as you get water and temperature change and roots of vegetation, it starts separating all those little pieces of stone that make up the mosaic. So it was cheap, and it got it out of sight and out of mind, but it's not an effective means of preservation. We'll want to go through the square here, which is all 1970s buildings, sort of urban renewal in Sremska Mitrovica. And underneath here, we probably have the original Roman city center, the Roman Forum, which has never been discovered yet, so that we have to see. But in 1976, they were excavating over on this side, over this way, for the Gradska Kafana, for the city. I don't know, you can't call it a cafe because a kafana is more than a cafe, but
kind of restaurant.
Restaurant, social center, bar. And they discovered the remains of a church here. And there was a lot of international concern about what would happen with it, and so UNESCO, the Agency of the United Nations for Culture, brought pressure to bear and also brought funding to complete the building right up here over the remains that are down below here. What you're looking at is then when they were going to build here, they came upon these remains. And so then funds were acquired. You can see these big concrete, this is reinforced concrete with metal inside of it. We call it rebar. And was built over it. So this is just the end of an early Christian basilica, a very standard 5th century design, which is the way the early Christians, when they started to create architecture for Christian liturgy, took the form of the Roman basilica, which was a long, narrow hall. So the rest of this building is under the street behind us, never excavated. And then the hall has this semicircular end termination. And in a Roman law court building, before it's religious, the praetor, the Roman judge, sat right here where this square is, right here. What the early Christians did was take the place where the Roman judge sat and put the altar there. And this is where the altar was, in this square place right here. A lot of this is built on earlier Roman buildings, so the foundations are wall remains from earlier Roman buildings. The date of this is 430 AD. That's 10, 15 years before Attila and the Huns come to this region and create a separate barbarian kingdom from Sremska Mitrovica to Niš to the Danube to Donji Milanovac. And so already probably there was a lot of stress on the city in those times because usually in city churches there are no burials. The burials are outside of town in the cemeteries, just like we usually have today. And we have 2 early Christian basilicas outside of town. But more than 20 burials were found in and around this church, so that means it wasn't secure to go outside of the city walls outside of town, and so that they buried in and around the basilica here. Locally, because the patron saint of Sremska Mitrovica, the terms Sremska and Mitrovica, Sremska is from Srem, which is from Roman Sirmium, which the Romans adapted from a local tribal name, which were the Sirmienses. So it goes all the way back that way. Mitrovica, you know, is Dimitri, is the Mitrov part of Dimitri. And so locally this is called the Basilica of St. Demetrius, but there's no direct evidence for that. He has a basilica here someplace in town, but we don't know where. Another thing is that because, as we've already discussed, Constantine was here. Constantine was a great church builder. All through the Roman Empire, from Jerusalem to Rome to other parts, he or his mother built a lot of churches with imperial money. And so he must have built some churches here in Sremska Mitrovica, but again, we don't have any direct evidence yet for it. But this is a great example of early Christian architecture. It follows the standard sort of design and layout. You can see from the icons on display here, every so often it's used for Eastern Christian liturgy, Serbian Orthodox Church. And then the other thing that's interesting about this, number one, it's urban location. So people going around here can look in and see it. So we're part of the center of town, visible. But you can see here, and if you go down here, you can see on this side, there's a kafana that's around the sides of it. It's all privately owned, and you can sit and have coffee and a drink and look at the basilica. So again, like with the kafić, the kafana, that's the cafe that's with the visitor center in the Imperial Palace, we have active participation of the local population in contact with the monument. And probably one of the most basic rules of historic preservation is that the monument has to be alive in the lives of the city it exists in. If it's isolated as a museum, as a cultural sacred place, it dies. And you have to start with education in the schools, teaching the population what they have, to make them proud of what they have and aware of the significance of this. So we've seen a very important monument in Roman imperial architecture on the secular side, and this is a standard basilica. Sirmium has more names of bishops in the early Christian church than any other site in the Balkans. We have some 11 names of early Christian bishops that were leaders of the congregation here. In February of 303 AD, when Diocletian was emperor and Galerius was his Caesar, they promulgated the last law of persecution against Christians, making it illegal to be a Christian, making it illegal for them to hold property. And they thought they could destroy Christianity by burning their sacred books too, the Bibles and the scriptures and all that. What they did in executing Christian leaders, they thought they would cut off the heads of the church, is to create the heroes of the early Christian church and in fact attract more congregation than diminishing it. So it had a reverse effect. And that was the last great persecution. Constantine comes along in 312, wins a big battle outside of Rome, and Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, and that changes the whole course of history for the whole world, in fact, with the advent of Christianity. So this is part of that. There are various ways of presenting monuments, and the old historical tradition through time in cities, especially let's say like Rome and Italy, if you discover the remains of a building, then you sort of reinforce it with modern cement and leave it out in the open, and that is the most primitive, basic type of preservation, which is called preservation in the open. In modern historic preservation theory, people have gradually gravitated towards a new type of concept which uses the Roman Latin phrase in situ, which means in place. And in and of itself, that phrase does not have much significance, but when we expand the meaning for historic preservation, it means that we take the authentic original remains on an archaeological site, we leave them there, we protect them, but then what we add to the presentation is the link between the monument and the people, the visitors who come to see it. What we add to that in the presentation is as many of the original artifacts. In the palace, they were mosaic artifacts, but they can be in a Roman house, they can be the plates on the dinner table that they ate off of, or goblets that they drank wine out of, or amphorae which they stored wine and olive oil in. So in situ presentation involves attaching the monument, the physical remains, to as many of the original artifacts that explain to you, the visitor, what the function of the building was originally. So we bring the authentic original life of the building back closer to the visitor. And that is what is known in preservation circles as in situ preservation.